next session, Marriage and the Metropolis. Elizabeth Flock will be in conversation with Peter Griffin. Elizabeth, journalist, author, and documentary filmmaker with a focus on women and social issues. Elizabeth's first book, Love and Marriage in Mumbai, is a study of contemporary marriage in India, told through the stories of 3 couples she followed over the course of a decade. Peter Griffin, journalist with The Hindu. Peter runs a creative community, Caferati, has co-curated the literature section of the Kala Ghoda Festival for several years, and he also writes poetry. I welcome the speakers. Peter will join Elizabeth shortly.
Is this on? Peter was my first editor ever in Bombay, notoriously late, and also usually goes to sleep around 3 in the morning, wakes up at about 4 in the afternoon. So this is entirely typical, and I will shame him aggressively when he comes back. So we'll just begin in a second. Here he is, the man himself.
Hi, good afternoon, and lovely to see you guys here. What we're going to do is sort of try and forget you, all of you are around, and just chat. We're all friends, we know each other for like 10 years now. And when Liz started her career in journalism, she worked for a magazine that I had just joined as well. She was a little, I think just a few weeks between us starting work there. And right from then, she was very literally fresh off the boat and hit the ground running, learnt the city, learnt how business worked in India. This was a business magazine. Learnt how to reach out and create her own networks. She relied a little bit on people around us, colleagues as well, and then developed her own networks all through that time. What I didn't know was that she'd also been thinking from that time onwards about this book. First I actually knew properly about the book was only a few years ago, and then when she asked me to read an almost final draft of it. And there again, the humility of this young woman came out to me again, because she, after spending like 9 years working on this book, making sure she had, done all the research, done a lot of the homework, spent enormous amounts of time. She says, can you just read it for me so that I don't make any non-Bombay white girl mistakes? And of course I read it, and before anyone else but her publisher and a few other friends got to do it, and I was very impressed. So what I thought we'd start out with is to first just say, why this book? Of all the things that you could have written, you spent those few years in India. When you went back to America, you worked in a variety of other jobs. You went off to study your narrative journalism course. You did all of those things. Why did you choose to write this book, which was actually a rather inconvenient book to write? You had to keep coming back to India every few years. Every year practically. You spend enormous amounts of time here and then go back. It's not an easy book to have done. So why this story? What grabbed you about wanting to tell the stories?
So the book, for those of you who have not read it, Love and Marriage in Mumbai, follows 3 married couples in Mumbai that are a range of ages, religious backgrounds, different stages in their marriage, and even different kinds of marriage. One is arranged marriage, one is a love marriage where they eloped against her parents' wishes, and one is sort of a hybrid of the two. And I truly didn't choose to write this book. It chose me. I moved to Mumbai back in 2008 to work for Forbes, as Peter said, and it was a time of personal upheaval for me. My father had just had his 3rd divorce, and I think at the time I was basically a young journalist, fresh out of college, with a lot of questions about why marriages work or fail anywhere in the world. And it was at this time that I met a number of couples in Mumbai who began telling me stories about their marriages. And for a variety of reasons, I ended up living with a number of Indian families, as many Ferengis do when they come to India. because so many people welcomed me into their homes. And as I did that, there were stories that people told me that I couldn't get out of my head even after I moved back to Bombay. And I found myself just sort of obsessively coming back to those stories and wanting to tell them. At first, I just started journaling about them. And then in the end, I came back and formally interviewed them about their marriages. And I think I was so desperate to get the answer to this question of, like, what makes a marriage work or fail anywhere in the world, whether it's in New York or DC or Mumbai or Hong Kong. What is the sort of universalities of that, and what is also very particular to Mumbai and India, which is undergoing so much social change that I thought was putting a lot of pressure on Indian couples. And so over time, it grew into this massive project in which I basically tried to take the strategy of immersion journalism, of immersing myself in these three couples' lives who are willing to let me in, and trying to tell the story, from the battleground of their marriage, in a sense. I think also marriage is often a subject that's not treated seriously by journalists as a subject. I get a lot of like, oh, you wrote a love and romance book, or, that people think marriage is not a subject worthy of consideration, but I think there actually is no subject more important to talk about because it affects all of us. And I think it's also really a barometer of social change in a country. And so through these three particular marriages, I thought I could learn so much.
Perhaps before we carry on, if you could just give us a short reading from the book so they get a flavor of how the book goes, and then we'll continue to chat.
Sure. So there's three couples in the book, Ashok and Parvati, who are very young, and they have a sort of hybrid love arranged marriage. They meet through an online matchmaker, bharatmatrimony.com, and their parents basically say you have to marry another Tambram, but they do get some choice in the matter. And then the second couple is Shahzad and Sabina, who are a much older Sunni Muslim couple from a very conservative community. And their story really revolves around the fact that they're unable to have a child. And actually, in this case, it's not the woman who's pining for a child, as we often hear in stories. It's Shahzad who can't. And the third couple, which I'm going to read you a small section from, is Maya and Veer. And they are 30s and 40s at this point, and they are the ones who had the love marriage. They eloped against her parents' wishes, and in this section we see that the cracks in their marriage are starting to show. And this is from the very beginning of the book. In Mumbai, people say the monsoons make everyone fall in love. But this year the rains are late, and the June nights are hot. So are tempers. Maya and Veer fight in the early mornings inside the bedroom of their 11th floor apartment in a colony of concrete apartment buildings in a far north suburb of the city. One morning, they fight so loudly it agitates 4-year-old Janu, who is playing with his toys in his bedroom down the hall. He pushes the door open to the room to see his father, in dress pants and no shirt, shout and point a finger at Maya, who is seated on their low bed. "Do not raise your voice with my mother," Janu says, in his grown-up way of speaking. "I do not like that. Say you're sorry." My superhero, thinks Maya. To her, Janu looks every bit the part, even though he is so little, with his dimpled chin and gelled hair combed off to one side, a single lock falling onto his forehead. Maya once thought Veer also looked like a superhero, with his glossy hair, open face, and irresistible smile. She didn't even mind his 6 toes or lazy eye, which he said were signs of extra specialness and good fortune. "I'm sorry," says Veer, not looking at Maya, as he gathers Janu up in his arms. In the days that follow, Veer and Maya hold their tempers in check. On cooler days, it is easier. And on a Sunday morning not long after, when several fragile clouds arrive to mercifully block out the sun, Veer surprises his wife and tells her he won't go to work that Sunday. Ordinarily, Veer spends Sundays as he does every day, working long hours at the family aluminum foil business. After he leaves, Maya and Janu often board the local train to go to Crossword, a chain bookstore that Maya loves for its fiction and its coffee shop. The shopkeepers let her son, Janu, play on the floor for hours while Maya sits hunched over a book, often by Rumi or Haruki Murakami. They will do anything for the attractive mother with the big, kohl-rimmed eyes and petite but curvy figure. "Madam," they whisper to each other, "looks just like a movie star." Let's go to crossword, Mayu, Veer says now, using his pet name for her, which he seldom does these days. I'll come along this time. If you are a stupid woman, Maya thinks, you'd say, well, at least he's around, Baba. But she knows he only wants to come for Janu. Okay, she says, and gathers up her purse and Janu's backpack and checks that she has both her phones. A text from Subal pops up on her screen. She checks it and then quickly puts her phone away. At the sight of Subal's name, her mind often wanders to that first day they spent at the local beach. The beach in a quiet seaside town is just 30 minutes away by auto rickshaw, but it feels a world apart from the city's pollution and chaos and noise. It is nothing like her frenetic suburb, once a small village and now one of the city's most congested areas. Within minutes along the drive to the beach, the roads become slow and winding. Along the route are small, quiet rivers where local people fish and young boys swim. And at the end of the road stands a grove of trees, which opens up onto a magical seaside hotel, whitewashed and sprawling and encompassed by green. The seaside hotel is their place. It is where Subal tried to steal a kiss in December when there was a mild breeze. They ate from the breakfast buffet and sat talking for more than an hour beside the pool. The water was a clear, still blue, and the palm tree fronds hung over them. Maya found herself drawing lines on his palms. They both wanted something, but did nothing. Then she and Subal had gone back again in May. Come on, Mayu, Veer says, and Maya refocuses on her husband, who is holding open the front door. He stands next to a colorful lettered sign that reads, Happy Star. It is the name Maya gave their home when they moved in.
So one of the things that struck me at this book when I first looked at it, when you first started talking to me about it, was that enormous amount of access that you got. One, the things that they were willing to tell you, things that they would tell only a close friend or dear one, and perhaps not even that. But at the same time, you are not in this book. Was it difficult to find that balance of being able to tell the story, keep them at the center of the story, not ever bring yourself in? Did it feel a little artificial at times? Because that access came from the fact that they felt a certain trust for you. And perhaps expanding from that, could you just talk about the process of how you reported this?
So the first draft of this book I was in, writing in the first person, and then I realized that the book was absolutely terrible. And I think part of the reason is that a lot of books written about India by white people have, to be honest, very arrogant first-person narrators who seem to say that they know a lot about India, and I actually feel the opposite, that there's so much about India that I don't know and will never know. And I felt that I wanted to let the people in the book speak for themselves about their marriages as much as is possible when I'm the person writing the book. And also to chart the changes that are happening in Mumbai and around India and the social change that they're seeing through their own voices. So that's the reason I took myself out of it. In terms of access, I think it helped that I worked on this project for an ungodly amount of time. 10 years is a long time. And I think as journalists, we often parachute in places. We're asked to go cover a fire, and then we're told to leave the next day. And obviously, you're getting a very artificial representation of what went on. And I think with marriage, it's even more important to spend the time. And whatever I felt like I knew about a couple, 1 year I would go back. I'd be certain that they were going to get divorced, and then I'd go back the next year. And they were taking quite a lot of delight in one another. And I think I learned that that's really where I started to see the roller coaster of marriages in these couples, and where I really understood the value of spending so much time. And I think over time I built trust with those people. And also it was certainly important that all of the names in the book were changed and locations left out, so that people felt more comfortable sharing things like their own infidelity, problems with infertility and impotence, really, really intimate details that I think couples anywhere in the world would be reticent to share, and certainly in middle-class Bombay, where there's the fear that people will talk and what people will say and what the community response will be. That's even more more important. So in terms of, I think your third question was about technique.
Process of reportage. How did you go about putting this story together, the
Yeah.
bits and pieces that went into the creation finally?
Yeah, I approached this as one of my professors at NYU when I was there talks about the art of hanging out, which I think is really important, just actually physically showing up and spending the time. And so I basically, I asked each of the couples if I could live with them and be there for a month at a time and not leave, and basically be incredibly annoying and in their faces when they were having good days and when they were having really bad days. And in the first week, everything was fine, and then the cracks start to show. And to their credit, there was never a moment in which they asked me to leave the room, and took thousands of pages of notes. But the book relies heavily not only on me being there, but also our interviews, which I did with the couples, both together and separately, because obviously people are going to tell you different things when they're sitting there with their husband beside them and when they're going to talk to you one-on-one. And also I relied on photographs that they shared, text messages that they shared, G-chats, emails, medical records, police records. So all of that came together to try to, for me to try to depict the changes in their marriages over time.
And did you find, as you said, what they would say when they were together and what they would say when you were talking to them separately would sometimes differ? You went around a little. Would the fact of you being the observer, how do you think that changed the stories they told you?
Yeah, I'm under no illusion that me being there didn't have an impact. I think as journalists, we would like to say that, I just went there, I did a few interviews, I left, and I didn't change the situation at all. But I think it's almost never true. And I think particularly in this project, just even asking people questions about their marriages is forcing them to think about things that maybe they weren't necessarily thinking about before. So I'm quite certain that me being there had an impact on their lives, and perhaps they would have been having different fights if I wasn't in the room. So this project will always be different than if there was somehow an invisible fly on the wall who could have seen it. But I think that, again, that's why I spent so much time, and is to try to get as close as possible to what was really going on.
You'd spoken about questions that you had for yourself when you started out with this book, and you were seeking answers. Your parents breaking up when you were younger, the fact of your father, I think was his third divorce at that time, right? You said?
3 out of 4, yeah.
Yeah. I remember you would, I'll come back to that one. But there was a number of things you were searching for there. You had found a certain amount of stability yourself at that point. And did you find any of the answers you were searching for in the process of writing this book? Or did you just find more interesting questions that you're going to continue to have to ask yourself? How did it go on this?
I think almost any book talk I've done, someone has asked me, like, okay, so what's the answer to love and marriage? And I wish that I had that. But I think there were certainly questions that I got answers to, or as you said, like at least more complicated questions. I think one thing that I took away is that it really doesn't matter if it's an arranged marriage or love marriage. That's not what determines whether a marriage is happy. It's dependent on so many other factors, like compatibility, chance. Do you and your husband grow together, or do you end up growing in different ways? Financial stability. There's a million factors that determine a happy marriage, but I think in the West, there's so much skepticism towards the idea of an arranged marriage, and of course there are arranged marriages that are deeply unhappy or even violent and have extreme problems, but to me, one learning from that perspective was that that is not what determines the happiness or unhappiness in a marriage. I think in the book, of the 3 couples, the couple that had the love marriage is the most unhappy.
So we talked about questions there, and what about the effects on you and your life? Just after the book was out, I think between just before the book coming out was in fact when a long relationship of yours broke up.
Thanks so much, Peter. I appreciate this.
That's the thing. I forgot that they were there, so I thought we could say this stuff. But yeah, you had that. You had this. The term. And how are the reactions of the people in your life to the book when they saw it come out? I remember you saying in one of your interviews that your dad was saying, with only half laughing, like how many times you were going to be talking about his marriages in your interviews. Your mum has never really addressed this with you in a big way. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is the effects on you and the people around you and their relationships with you, your understanding of those. Did you progress in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had this artificial idea in my mind that if I did a project, a really long, deeply researched project on love and marriage, that at the end I would have it figured out for myself personally, and that I would have the most beautiful relationship of my own because I had to have all of the answers. And the fact of the matter is that that's not what happened, and I think it's actually only made me more skeptical about the institution of marriage, whether it's here in India or in my home country. And I think one unanticipated effect is that sometimes there's, when you study a subject so deeply, you find out things you don't want to know, which is, and I think, why we often only hear and see stories about love that end with marriage, right? Like every story is their love story, and then they will live happily ever after. That's the stories we get in Hollywood and Bollywood, and perhaps there's a reason for that, because we don't want to talk about how difficult love can be in the context of marriage after you say I do. So, but to me, I thought it was really important to examine this. Like, what does this look like? Like, even my friends at home in the United States, if I ask them how their marriages are going, no one wants to say when their marriages aren't going well. No one wants to talk about that. No, if they're never going to say my husband and I are fighting every night. They'll just say it's great. And I think that does a disservice to all of us. And so I think finding out so much about how difficult marriage can be did have a negative impact on me as a person, and my own ability to form relationships, to be honest.
Yeah, so this is a conversation we had when we were discussing the proof as well. When, to be fair, when I was also going through a breakup at that point. So, okay, now we've both talked about our breakups at that point, and we can leave that bit behind. But
We're even.
we're even now, and you're not going to beat me up afterwards. So now, let's go to the other part of the title, which is the Mumbai part. And through that, a sort of a view of metropolitan India, and perhaps a little bit about the preconceptions that you came with, and what surprised you in the course
About Mumbai.
about Mumbai and marriage, that part of it. And I think one of the things you said, that the arranged marriage was in some ways become a far more understanding one. The people who would marriage for love were actually in the deepest trouble in some ways. So I'm saying, aside from that, the longer things, the larger views of marriage in this very complicated city, what kind of views did you come in with on that? What have you perhaps been surprised by? What were you expecting and what were you surprised by most?
Well, I think in the West, the stories we get about India are either exoticized stories of, snake charmers and godmen, or there's salacious stories about horrific sexual assaults, and we often do not hear the other stories. As a child, my mom was really into me watching foreign cinema, so I got a lot of exposure to Bollywood early on, and so I think I formed a lot of my views about love in Mumbai and in India from watching Bollywood films. I think, idealized love in India as this big, showy, imaginative love where people made over-the-top gestures, and I contrasted that with what I saw among my own peers, where people, the opposite was true. People did not want to show off how much they loved someone because that would be showing your cards, and you don't want to show someone how much you love them. You want to keep it hidden. And I always felt that the opposite approach was better. Perhaps I'm too earnest of a person. To a certain extent, of course, that depiction is accurate, but certainly I came in very starry-eyed at age 21, thinking that Mumbai was going to be exactly what I had seen in Bollywood movies, and also what I had read in basically Maximum City and Shantaram. Those were my points of reference, like many white people coming to Mumbai for the first time. And of course, that narrative only became more and more complicated. Mumbai is incredibly romantic, and it's also incredibly cruel. And I think that is how love is, actually. And so that was something that was a difficult learning for me over time, is sort of the darker parts of the city and the darker parts of love and the darker parts of marriage. And so I think that was the biggest thing that I continue to struggle with to this day.
The other thing that I was wondering here again, where the observer altering the experiment by just being there, and the fact now the research report, so to speak, the book is out. Do you think, and do you know that the fact of the book being out right now, has that further changed things for any of our three couples?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I still talk to them, all of them, on a weekly basis. Most of them read the book before it came out in India and had the opportunity to, if there was anything they wanted taken out. But thankfully, there were only a very few small things. Two of the people in the book have not read it, and I asked them why. And one of them was Sabina, the older Muslim woman in the book, and she basically told me that it was a frivolous project, so she didn't feel the need to read it, which is fair. And the other is Veer, who's the husband of Maya, who has an affair. And I think for him, he basically said, I live this, I don't need to read it, which is also fair. So I'm not sure. I know that Ashok and Parvati read the book together, side by side, in bed, and then had conversations about it, chapter by chapter, which I thought was quite brave and amazing. And I saw them 2 weeks ago, and they said it started some conversations for them that they had not had. So yeah, I'm sure it impacted things in ways that I don't know. But I think one thing that Parvati said to me, and which was my original intention, was, to me, she said, it's important that if there are other Parvatis out there who, in her case, desperately wanted to have a love marriage, was in love with a Christian boy, her parents would not let her marry him because he was not a Tambram, and they basically said, you have to marry another Tambram. And she ultimately gave in, and she's now married to Ashok, who's another Tambram, and they just had a baby girl. And she said, if there are other Parvatis out there who dealt with the same thing, then it's worth it to me to tell my story. But interestingly, I asked Parvati, so are you going to allow your daughter to have a love marriage? And she said, absolutely not. Which, I think says a lot about how social change happens, which is that it's very staggered, and that, people will look at it and say, like, okay, women are having so many more love marriages, or people are getting married later, or they're having more sex outside of marriage, or more divorces are happening. So there's all this change, right? So it's all moving linearly on this line, and then the next generation will be more progressive than the last. And that's actually, I think, a very two-dimensional way of looking at it, because this change happens in a way that's very, like, one step forward, two steps back. And for Parvati, she basically said, I saw how much turmoil it caused me to try to have a love marriage, and so I don't want my daughter to also go through that. And so I thought that was very interesting.
Do you think there's scope, or is it in your mind to look beyond this book at these couples, to continue to track them over time? Or is this story told now, as far as you're concerned? And I know you're on other projects, and we'll talk about those perhaps for a minute or two at the end, about what you're doing further. But as for this, is this now closed? Will this continue in some form?
No. I'm quite happy now to just be there in their lives and for them to be in mine, and not to have the sort of tension of me writing something about it. So, and I'm interested and I care whatever happens to them, but there was a point in this book where I basically said, we have to stop now, and there is no real end to these stories. They go on, and they'll go on until they die or until the next generation. But I think the point at which I knew I had to stop is when I had about 1,000 Post-it notes on the wall, all multicolored, and I was moving them around like a madman, and my mom asked if she needed to check me into a mental facility. And I thought, okay, it's time to stop now and find a cutoff point.
Before we continue, I just want a broad idea of, do any of you have questions? Accordingly, I'm going to keep time for that, because I'd like you to have time for your questions. If you could just raise your hand so I know approximately how many people have questions. Cool. And how are we doing for time? We're not in time trouble yet. Okay, we'll find out. How much time do we have? Oh, cool. So we have plenty of time for questions. So we'll continue to chat, and I'll come back to you with, we'll send the mic out to you in about 5 minutes from now. Please collect your questions, and we'll try and, because I want it to be as interactive as possible, and not just me talking to Liz here, as much as I enjoy that. But, so Liz, just before we go on to asking about this, your continued engagement with India, you're finding out about other aspects of India now. In the time that you were here, you did see other parts of India, but they were largely things like little vacations, going out to a friend's wedding, hanging out. You're now immersing yourself in parts of India that you had not seen before. I don't know how much you want to talk about the projects that you're working on right now, so I'm not saying anything about it, but it's up to you if you want to talk about what you're talking.
Well, I was telling Peter yesterday that I realized only on this last trip that the majority of my own perceptions of India have been shaped by middle-class Mumbai, because that is where I've spent the most of my time. And I think it was Tagore that said that if anyone says they understand India, they're either wrong or mad. And it's true that there are a million Indias. It's probably the most diverse country in the world in every sense of that word: class, caste, ethnicity, language. And so there is no understanding. There is no one India. And most recently, I was on another reporting project in Uttar Pradesh, following a female vigilante group there, and it could have been another continent, truly, in every sense of the word, from this project. So, yeah. And I want to spend a little more time before we get to the audience to look again at a literary festival. There are always going to be young developing writers, journalists, reporters who are learning how to tell a better story. If we could just spend a few minutes on what you learned about telling a story in the course of this long narrative journalism project, and what are the important lessons that you got out here that perhaps you could share for the younger people here? Well, this book is narrative nonfiction, which is sort of a weird genre because it's a mix of rigorous reporting and creativity. And if you'll talk to some old school journalists, they'll actually say that they hate this genre even exists because there shouldn't be like literary techniques applied to journalism. I happen to disagree because I think it gets people to engage in subjects that they otherwise would not read about. I wrote this book more like a novel because I hoped that that would make people read about a subject they might not otherwise be interested in. I think as a young journalist now, so much of what people are expected to do is do really quick journalism, to be on the internet all the time, to be on social media, to be doing quick takes, to get page views. And I think I learned very much in my own career that the opposite was going to yield a lot more in terms of good journalism and good writing, which is like spending time and immersing yourself in things. And so if I had any advice that I could go back and tell myself or to tell young journalists today is like, you don't have to be held hostage to the demands of online quick hit journalism. And I think the same applies for writing, which is like, you don't have to produce a book this year. You can take time and keep journals for a decade before you get to the thing, and you'll know when it's the right time. If I had written this book 10 years ago, it would have been an incredibly bad two-dimensional book, and I think spending the time in the end was worth it. I mean, I'm on your side on this one. I may work for a newspaper, but I believe in narration and telling stories. But like 10 years, spending that much time to tell the story does seem a bit extreme. I did other things in that time. Yeah. Let's throw this open to you guys. We have about 15 minutes left. We had about 4 or 5 people, gentleman here, the gentleman next to him, the lady in the third row, and the gentleman at the back there. We'll start with them. Okay?
Did you ever have to play peacemaker? Or did they ask you for advice, or did you offer advice?
Yes, and I tried not to as much as possible because I felt like I wanted to be obviously objective and not. And you know, that was hard because there were times where Veer, for example, is a workaholic. He never comes home on time, and at a certain point, I just wanted to say to him, like, "Hey, just come home on time. Things will be much better for you," you know. And I had to really restrain myself with that. But yeah, there were times, especially with Maya and Veer, when they'd be in a fight, and then they'd turn to me and say, "What do you think?" And I tried to be like as diplomatic and as possible and ask them a question. Well, like, what do you think about that? Because I didn't want to get involved, but I think it was nearly impossible not to a certain extent. So.
Elizabeth, I'm quite intrigued about the methodology which you used. While during the conversation you were talking about the entire process, and I was wondering whether you were influenced by the anthropological methodology, because you spent almost a decade with this couple. So was you influenced by that, where you were trying to look at them from a objective participant observer because you lived with the family? And within anthropological methodology, there are two schools. One is ethic, where you're, and the question which our other friend asked, you are essentially trying to say that, hey, I want to be living their life through a phonetic world, or rather than a mimic world, yeah? So I just want to figure out, not through the process which you described, but what methodology did you use? Vis-a-vis, of late, people are talking about phenomenology, where they say that, hey, we want to observe the couple and we want to understand the meaning from their perspective. So what methodology did you use?
Yeah, I mean, I've never studied anthropology or sociology, but certainly from what I have read of anthropology, I mean, I've never studied in a formal way, but I certainly look to them a little bit, those fields a little bit for guidance. Narrative nonfiction is growing hugely in the United States in terms of people who are practicing that kind of narrative nonfiction that is fully immersive, that does take chapters out of the anthropological and sociological field work methods. I think going forward, I think at the time it was a bit more like ad hoc, like I was figuring out as I went, and there are so many ethical landmines when it comes to doing this kind of work, as I imagine there are for anthropologists as well. Like, do you intervene when something happens? What if something terrible happens? Do you intervene? What is the role that you're playing? What is the influence you have on these people's lives? What is the influence going to be when the book comes out? And I think that's something that as journalists we're very much still figuring out, and a lot of people don't like to talk about these things because they're somewhat controversial, but I think it's really important that we do and like interrogate ourselves in our own work about what we're doing and the impact that it's having. So I wish I could say that I think my methods came more from journalists. In particular, I mean, Catherine Boo used a lot of the same strategies, right, in Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and her book was controversial for similar, for reasons. I think that it does make people uncomfortable sometimes to read this kind of work because you're sort of like, well, how did you get so close, and what's the impact of that? So I basically think we should have more discussions about that and how it's practiced, but in general, my strategy was be there, do the work, keep showing up, as long as you can and as long as humanly possible for you as a person, and do as many interviews. And one last thing I'll say is that an issue that kept coming up for me was memory, because so many people had divergent memories of things. Like Maya would say the day she met Subal, it was pouring rain, and Subal said it was the brightest day of the year. I mean, something as simple as that, but then there were also much more difficult things about like a fight that someone had, and that made me realize what different realities we're all living in, and so how do you address that in your writing? And I tried as much as possible to indicate to the reader when subjects had different memories, but there's no way you're going to ever resolve that 100%, so it's difficult.
Hi. So I was touched about your personal sharing, the idea that you got sort of more disenchanted with marriage through your writing. And also the thing that you said about how Bombay is both romantic and cruel. it's also my experience that Mumbai is particularly the most cruel city I've been in, although it has this. So now that you move on and sort of see other parts of India, do you think that marriage and extending over to India is something that you would rethink or revisit? Or yeah, I wonder if Bombay starts to seem like a sampling bias in some sense. What do you think?
I mean, there are a million love stories. I mean, truly a billion love stories to tell here in this country, correct, right? And Bombay is an artificial sample because it's just one, and it's perhaps India's most permissive city, so you're going to get a very different picture. Just last week when I was in Uttar Pradesh, I started thinking like, Jesus, I should have done this book about, rural village life and couples there and sex lives there, and there's so many stories to be told there, and it's so very complicated, and there's so much going on. It's so different from the portrait I got here, but I don't know. I mean, I thought I was going to be done reporting on India after this first book, but I'm here back again doing reporting, so I can't seem to quite leave. So yeah, I think in particular rural sex lives of village women is something that I think would be...
Sex life. No, I mean the cruelty part. Is that
cruelty.
the permissiveness of Bombay? Yes, but also
Yeah.
the cruelty, I think you get right in some sense.
Yeah. So what is your question about the cruelty?
So would that be the place with the most broken of marriages? And is that similar to what is modern society? But
I don't know. I think the couples I was with last week had more cruelty in their lives. So I don't think there's any way of knowing for sure the most cruel place to be in love, but yeah, Bombay is certainly one of them.
If I may also there, perhaps defining broken is not exactly going to be easy. For instance, just statistics on divorce. If we see divorce rising, does it mean, what exactly does that mean? And you see it in different kinds of places. Conflict of various kinds, violence against women. Some, like, the cases, there are more women, say, standing up to report or to go to the law, which doesn't mean that it's getting worse. It may, in a way, mean that it's getting better. If more women are willing to stand up and are able to stand up, and society is taking their word seriously enough, it actually can mean that there's something good happening around there, that people are not willing to sit there and take it for the rest of their lives. There was a gentleman at the back who had a question.
Yeah.
Could you please stand?
Hi,
sir?
Elizabeth. Been enjoying your...
Could you stand up, please, sir, so just so we know where you are?
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Your talk has been both interesting and instructive. My question would be, what would your advice be if you're asked to give advice for somebody who's about to get married, say in Bombay, or somebody who's in a marriage in Bombay? What would your advice be?
I'm reticent to give any advice. However, I think one thing that I keep thinking about is expectations and the expectations that all of us bring to our relationships. And I know for myself, I often bring very high expectations to my relationships and ask so much of my partner. And the fact is that one person, of course, cannot do everything for you, and they cannot be everything to you. And they are not going to fulfill all of your expectations, and in fact, they may disappoint many of them. And assuming that your marriage is not violent or doesn't have some terrible problem, but assuming that things are okay, I do think that letting go of a few of those expectations and allowing yourself to see the person as they are and not as you want them to be is something that I keep coming back to as very important.
Any questions from this side? Yeah, you guys are all asleep or what? Okay, cool. There was a gentleman here who raised his hand, the bearded gentleman in the middle.
Hi.
Hello.
You appear to have a firm understanding of the setup in India, the societal setup in India surrounding marriages, from a Westerner's perspective. So you must have heard of the saying that marriages in India are a union of families and not of individuals. I'm sure you've come across this.
Sure.
So my question is in relation to this, basically. So bear with me, it's a bit long. I have a few white friends, and they have, when they describe their relationship with their girlfriends, they talk about first base and second base. But in Indian, it's more complicated. In case you didn't know, cricket is the most popular sport here. So we have a long on, we have 4 slips, we have a mid-off, we have a mid-on, and we have a man standing at point, and all of these guys and gals, they represent the woman's family. So it's like a landmine. It's like a war zone, basically. That's what it's like, in simple terms. So what I'm trying to ask is, to what extent do you think that this societal pressure to be a certain way, for a couple to be or act in a certain way, to do certain things, to what extent does this societal pressure dictate the outcome of the relationship? For example, you brought up the couple who were unable to conceive.
Yeah.
Something was wrong with the guy, I believe.
Yeah.
I don't know what his name was.
Yes.
Okay, but something was wrong with him, within double quotations. Anyways, why couldn't they explore the option of adoption? And how does the guy's family have a say in this? Because I have known people who wanted to adopt. They were not allowed to adopt because of their families.
Yeah.
So in short is your question,
So
how much
what impact does this societal pressure have on the relationship as a whole? Does it
Yeah.
ruin it? Because from my perspective, it feels like it does ruin it to a degree, if not a lot.
So to answer about the adoption, Shahzad and Sabina were not able to adopt because they come from a very conservative Sunni Muslim community that believes, according to a specific passage in the Quran, that adoption is wrong. And so for that reason, and that is changing in their community, but it's changed too late for them. To your wider question about social pressures and family pressures, I think it's hugely impactful. It makes me think of, I did an interview with a therapist, and he said 90% of the people I see have stress and anxiety and depression related to living in joint families and related to family pressures. And he said, it's only natural that when you're living in a joint family, it's more people, it's more problems. And in-laws are difficult anywhere in the world, but I think in India, in-laws can be particularly demanding. So yeah, there's a million pressures, and I think that's a lot of what this book was about, is about the pressures that exist on couples who are trying to make their way as social change is happening around them, but while their families and communities might have older ideas about what is expected of them and how do they reconcile those two things. And so people are dealing with that in all kinds of ways. I mean, some people are living in single-family homes now to avoid the problems of a joint family. And some people are having divorce despite the stigma that might be associated with, although divorce remains the lowest in India of anywhere in the world. So, obviously individuals are dealing with it in different ways.
Do we have anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello.
I haven't read your book yet, so but I understand from what you said right now that it's about 3 married couples, right?
Yes.
So did you ever think about exploring a live-in couple?
A live-in couple. Yeah, I would have loved to. That's not that population is very small comparatively. And I was interested in specifically married couples and what happens after marriage. But of course, that would be very interesting.
So why I ask that is,
Yeah.
this is something which most of my generation really go through now, right? I mean, you can call it educated, urban, or maybe even the others as well. Is it the idea of man and woman relationship, familiarity breeds contempt, or is it that because they were married, the legality adds a lot more pressure because your exit becomes that much more difficult, be it abroad or be it in India, right? So what is your perspective on that? Would a live-in be a little bit different? Either of the partners, would the exit have been more easier?
Yeah, I think a lot of live-in couples in India obviously face the pressures that their parents may not be happy about that, their community may not be happy about that. I know when I was dating someone here, I would lie and say he was my husband in order to be able to do many things, and it would be fine. So obviously if you're dealing with that kind of pressure, it adds, but marriage adds its own pressure. So
is it marriage or a man-woman relationship itself? I mean, talking about heterosexual couple, is it just a man-woman relationship itself?
Can we continue the conversation perhaps, because we'll hold up the next session?
Sure. Thank you.
Elizabeth's book
Thank
is
you.
available, and she's available to sign copies. Do buy the book. I tell you this not as Elizabeth's friend, which I am, on full disclosure, but because I enjoyed the book myself, and I do think you'll find a lot in it that's illuminating, that's interesting, that informs you about India and about the times and the place that we're living in this country. So please do buy the book, and thank you, Liz, for
Thank you
spending the
so
time
much,
with us.
Peter. Thank you,
Thank you, all
guys.
of you. Good day.